Well, thank you. Thanks so much for everyone being here today on a kind of gray Saturday afternoon. But I'm very excited to be on stage with these wonderful artists and to have an opportunity to really talk about what I experienced personally as a transformative public art experience, and to also talk a little bit about, as Candy and James have been thinking about, well, what next for this amazing project, to be a part of that discussion with these two wonderful artists. Today, just a brief outline, and then I'll turn it over to Candy and James to give you a little background about the project. And if you didn't have the opportunity to take part and see it, you'll be seeing a little bit of it in a moment. We'll start with that overview. Then I will talk a little bit about my personal experience with the monument, as well as some of the themes and inspirations and ways in which what emerged from this project, how it dovetails with the work that I do, in particular on anxiety and on emotional health and well-being. And then we want to open it up very quickly to the audience. This is a workshop after all, and so we'd love to talk with all of you and share some ideas about new ways and new stories we can tell about hope and anxiety, and open it up to your input and experiences. So I think without further ado, James and Candy.
Yeah. Thanks, Tracy. Thank you so much for being here. And Tracy's so humble, because James and I have been working with her for a few months now to start to make sense of the results of this project over time. And so, this was up for all of 2018, and then Tracy has done a lot of work with the Rubin, and so we connected last year and have been having a lot of discussions about how to dig deeper into this project. And so we want to, James and I want to give you a quick kind of rundown of the project and a little bit about some of the themes that have emerged, a little bit of the insights and what we're working on together too. Before we get into that, we just want to share a little bit of our background and where this project is coming from for us. And also, you saw that there are anxiety and hope cards on your chairs. Please, you're welcome to fill them out now or at any time if you want to simmer on it. These cards are for you to keep, so it's not going to be this spotlight moment. But later on in this event, we hope that people can share some of them and we can learn from each other's experiences. So I studied urban planning and design, and I started out creating a lot of interactive participatory experiments in public space to see, what if we had more spaces to easily share more with our neighbors and the people around us. And these are really civic-minded projects at first, inviting people to share their hopes for the future, vacant buildings. And then James's mother died suddenly. We've been together for a long time. And she was like a mentor to me. She was so critical, the one who really pushed me to pursue my creativity when I was a really confused and conflicted teenager. And after that grief and depression and despair, my questions about public space and what are in them changed. My inner world didn't feel like it belonged outside at all. And then I made the Before I Die project on this abandoned house in my neighborhood in New Orleans, just to try to restore perspective and maybe find a little consolation with my neighbors. I didn't know what to expect, but the responses I saw on this wall, the deeply personal ones, affected me greatly, really consoled me during some of my toughest times, and reminded me how much I'm not alone as I'm trying to make sense of my life. And so never expected it, but this project grew into this global thing, and now there are over 5,000 Before I Die walls around the world. And since then, I've become really passionate about creating more spaces to uncover our inner lives, to expose the unspoken, to create more public rituals for our emotional health, like the Confessions Project, where people can share their confessions in public space, and the Atlas of Tomorrow, which is this interactive tool inspired by the I Ching to maybe help us take the next step, to find hope and guidance as we make sense of our lives. And James wrote all of the stories, these 64 stories, these fables along this wall, and this is when we began to work more and more together on public art projects.
And yeah, we started working together. My training is in graphic design and education. After I lost my mom, I guess my way of dealing with grief was I went to law school for a minute. That was strange. Yeah. And then ended up driving like 100,000 miles through the country, just talking to people. This is maybe about 6 or 7 years ago, and just basically weirding out in America was my shtick for a bit. And started working more and more closely with Candy on these projects. You know, we did this project about grief in Greece. We're doing a project about emotional barriers as part of this Walls exhibition in Los Angeles. And really thinking through how ritual is informing the way we live today, whether sometimes there are rituals that are unintentional, and also this idea of like where it's going to be in the future. And I'm in control? Yeah. Okay. And when the Rubin invited us to do this project about, did we want to do a project about the future? It really spoke to something we were thinking about at that time, which is a sort of faith in the future, but also a lot of anxiety about the future. In my teaching, with my students, a lot of times they're so excited about the future, this is particularly within design, of these words like we're going to disrupt and engage and so on. And I end up feeling like the Ghost to Christmas Future sometimes, where I'm like, well, we have enough roadmap behind us to see that some of this stuff isn't working out so well. We created an online yearbook that's turned into this agitprop machine surveillance state, and I'm not sure how we're going to do with like smart cities and smart cars. And I have this sort of anxiety about the future and where we're headed. And I wanted to know, there's this persistent faith, but at the same time, I'm feeling really down about it. And how are other people feeling, basically? And so Candy and I kept thinking about this. And I remember one moment we were sitting outside drinking coffee, just watching people go by and thinking, how many of the people passing by are excited about tomorrow? And if so, why? Or why are they anxious? And what are those anxieties? And are they similar to the ones that we're constantly talking about? So that was kind of the question that started this project. And yeah, the thing is where do we have those conversations? I think was the big question we started thinking about. And the Rubin seemed like a really good space to do that, because so much of our public space doesn't allow us to share these sorts of conversations, right? And that's something that's very true. We could talk about our built environment and so on, but it's also something that was very personal to me. After I lost my mother, and then right after I lost my father, well, actually this was probably about a month or two afterwards. I remember I was in a grocery store, and it was just one of those hard days where grief was just really with me. And I was standing in line, and everybody there was my age or older. And I felt so isolated. Because that's how grief works, right? I mean, it's like a universal thing we're all going to have to deal with, but at the same time, only we really know what we've lost, and so it can be very personal, very isolating. And I'm standing in line just feeling really alone, and I'm looking around at all these people that are, around my age or older, and thinking, everybody's going through this, or they will, or they've experienced something similar. Why do I feel so alone? And when I stepped out of the grocery store and just saw our visual culture, our landscape of, be happy, buy these pants, and be entertained, and watch this thing, or whatever it was, there's just this question of we don't have these spaces to have these conversations, And of course, because there's no profit in it, our visual culture is really designed to keep us unhappy, because happy people don't tend to want or need, And so then we start thinking about, well, okay, online, And again, it's interesting to think that, probably 10 years ago, there were a lot of TED Talks or, think pieces about once strangers can connect online, we'll become more compassionate and empathetic. And it didn't really work out that way. There's this sort of race to the bottom with just these blind algorithms, because for whatever, I'm sure there's, Tracy could speak to this, there's some biological thing where it's just the clicks and the outrage are where we end up going. And a lot of that is so much by design. And so trying to think of ways that we can sort of get outside of these spaces and start to have these conversations is something that Candy and I have been thinking about quite a lot. But yeah, I mean, we saw that reflected in a lot of the responses that we received. Even this response, I want everyone to like me. I'm that's so true. I would never tweet that. But it's probably one of the truest things that I've seen on the wall, and so to create a space where people can kind of open up and share these types of things, because for some reason we've gotten into this situation where, at least for me, I feel like a lot of times I feel like I'm performing for this idiotic scoreboard of like likes and hearts and stars and thumbs, or, you know, like, and it's changed, you know. And I say all of this, it's obviously not breaking news and it's not terribly interesting or exciting, but I say all of this in context of this project just to remind myself that we're up against a lot, you know, like there's so many things that are competing. It's basically a war on our attention. I mean, even the language of it, right? Like, you know, campaign and viral and target, like the language of marketing is really militarized and it's coming for us. And so it's like, how do you, and so we're up against so much every day competing for our attention and our emotions that we have to give ourselves credit, you know, like it's just amazing sometimes that we get dressed and go outside and don't yell at the sky, so.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, I think I'm done talking about that.
Well, yeah, so we saw a lot of that, a lot of responses that are around this atmosphere that feels like America feels more polarized than ever. You know, that it's really easy to be angry at someone when you can judge them just one-dimensionally, and it's easy to forget the humanity in the people around us. You know, we're all right now going through so many challenges in our lives, and there's so much comfort in knowing that you're not alone. But I find that it's so easy to forget that because there's so many barriers to opening up. And while those barriers remain, it's really easy to forget the humanity and the people around us and become impersonal and then even adversarial. And I've seen it's really easy to be an angry neighbor when you don't know the other person. And for me, when I feel fear or anxiety or confusion, I often do my very best to hide it from others. So people think that I'm reliable, that things are under control, that you can count on me, there's nothing to worry about. You know, I think there's so much that we don't share out of fear of judgment. And we put on a lot of good shows for one another. And this project revealed how quickly we'll expose our struggles and vulnerabilities, you know, when given the right conditions. And so that's where we've seen the value of anonymity, that this anonymous, you know, personal prompt can offer this gentle first step towards honesty and vulnerability in public, you know, which can lead to understanding, consolation, maybe some kinship. And it cuts through all that small talk we go through to get down, dig deeper into the things that are really meaningful to us, the things that are really impacting us, and can be like the first step towards deeper discussions about this and maybe of what our communities really need, you know. And so, I mean, with these projects, seeing some private corner of your psyche, you know, reflected in someone else's handwriting on this giant wall in public, it can be incredibly reassuring on an individual level. And it might be a step towards helping us see ourselves in each other, you know, especially during these days of increasing polarization.
Yeah, and I mean, going back to, you know, me standing in that grocery store and just thinking about that sort of visual culture that not only ignores but actively denies a lot of these messier emotions that we have. There's just something so incredibly reassuring for me when, you know, we did this project and I just saw somebody else's handwriting saying something very similar that I've been going through. To know that some other person had stood there in the personality expressed by their pen and occupied that space. Yeah, and that sense of presence was really nice to have. What I also found was that reading through these, and now we have a closet of 55,000 of them, so there's a lot of reading material. It just changes. Even sometimes if it's only briefly, it changes the way that I look at people when I walk down the street. You know, for a moment, I'm just sort of jolted back into a reminder that everybody around me, all the strangers that I'm passing and so on, are all carrying all this head noise and chatter and all these things, all this walking wounded, all these tragedies that we undergo. And it just sort of makes me feel connected again. And then it starts to fade and I get all selfish again and I have to be reminded. But I think there is a lot of value in that, of just being able to have a space that we can see this in public and that's not just so much reserved for our private journals.
Yeah, and I think this is where, for us, for me, I think mental health is such an important issue with these projects, that among the many aspects that determine our overall health, our mental health is often neglected and can be taboo to discuss. And I've gone through many periods of depression, of crippling anxiety that's prevented me from forming new relationships, from meeting other people, from pursuing my dreams, from growing in any sort of way. And over time, I feel like, sometimes when we talk about mental health, we only talk about it in the extreme. But I would say that we all have mental health issues. It's this spectrum, it's this continuum, and at various times in our lives, we may experience stress or sorrow or anxiety or confusion. And these feelings, I've experienced this, can easily escalate into more serious conditions like addiction, depression, or self-destruction if we ignore them. It's so easy to ignore them when we're surrounded by a million distractions. And I feel like that's me. Like for me, like my problem is more one of neglect. I feel like I have often avoided conflict, and for a long time I was very reserved about my emotions, and I avoided confronting lots of different anxieties from my parents' expectations of me to just the specter of death. And when I avoided these things, part of it was just because in the world, everyone else seemed to be trucking along just fine. There wasn't sort of a space or sort of an encouragement to really dig deeper. But I realized that over time, as I avoided these feelings, they would always just manifest sideways, right? And come out in other ways like resentment or depression or self-destruction in different ways. And once I began to understand these, complicated, difficult emotions, I developed these much richer relationships with, my parents and beyond, and a lot more meaning in my relationships and where I'm moving in my life. And James and I think many of us here, we're a part of this growing population that isn't particularly religious, but yearns for some kind of spirituality, some kind of inner peace, some kind of connection with something larger than ourselves. And I think there's a lot of opportunity to reimagine what secular spirituality can look like and how our cities can better address our psychological health. James and I now do a lot of work under the name ritual fields, because this is an area that really interests us a lot. The value in rituals for our psychological health, for our mental health, for our emotional communion together.
Yeah, and this question of ritual is something that, I've been thinking about a lot. I mean, I have this ritual, like when I wake up, I look at my phone, and I try so hard not to do that. And it's embarrassing to admit, why would I? And I keep wondering, is that some new behavior that's been sort of hardwired into me, or is it the same thing as maybe 50 years ago, go get the New York Times off the front stoop or something? But for me, there's this, it's more compulsive. There's this weird need, and I guess that is some sort of a ritual. But either way, so we establish, okay, these little magical pieces of glass might not be so healthy. We're becoming more aware of that, and there's cause for hope in that. But then beyond that, okay, well, what are we going to be replacing that with? And I've noticed lately, and Candy and I have been talking about, the way things are socially, politically right now, that in climate change, that things are starting to feel a little bit more in flux and more unstable. There's some weird part of me that feels like there's a sense of ever going back to normal, and I don't know if that's ever actually going to happen. That's just some sort of fictional nostalgia, right? What does that mean to go back to normal? But as things become a little bit more chaotic and so on, how is that going to affect ritual and even religion and sort of faith and so on? Is it going to become something where we are becoming more scientific and more secularized, or is it becoming something where it's going to create some sort of opening for people to be dealing with chaos and flux by retreating into the otherworldly, or dogma, or sort of faith dealers and we're just trying to think through where is the role of ritual going to be in the future? That's just something we've been kicking around that just came to mind. But as far as how we're dealing with these issues now, we have anxiety, and then we have this sort of sense of hope. And what was interesting was, like I said, that we had this question of what are people anxious about right now, and if they're hopeful, why? Because a lot of times when I was down, I would go look at the hopeful side, and it would shore me up for a bit, And I thought anxiety was really going to outstrip hope when we did this wall, because it was up for a year. but we were pleasantly surprised to see that they were either on par or hope was winning by a little bit. I feel like it's during that whole love-hate thing, Robert Mitchum, but it was interesting to see that. And we were thinking through, like, well, why was hope winning, if we put it that way? And I think there were some interesting things to think about. One is that a lot of times people come to the Rubin with other people. So maybe if you're coming, you're not going to say, like, oh, I'm anxious because my marriage is falling apart. You know, you might do something. There also might be something a little bit more constructive or assuring. If I'd much rather write down something I'm hopeful for than deal with the anxiety. So maybe people are just like, oh, I don't want to think about that table or that side. But it's interesting to kind of think through, like, the sort of design of the space and why one might be outstripping the other. And as we're thinking through how these things start to map out, the big question was, and we had, as we started looking at this wall with 53,000 sheets of paper on it, so what is this telling us? You know, and so we've created this sort of system right now that we're working on to start kind of classifying and cataloging them. And our goal is to input all 53,000 responses and start to see some of the trends that are emerging. And there have been some that have been really eye-opening. You know, the prevalence of some things I might not have expected to the extent that they were, of people immediately articulating, say, climate, or the prevalence of addiction, and just being able to see a graph of how many lives it touches, not just the person suffering, but I'm worried about my son or a friend or a colleague. So we're starting to see these sort of patterns emerge, and then these sort of broader aspects of it in terms of, like, the scope. You know, how many of our anxieties are about the self? You know, it's something that I'm doing, versus, you know, how much of my sense of hope or well-being or anxiety might be coming from my immediate relationships or the people in my life. So there's this other sort of range. You know, a variety of relationships, both in terms of, like, the romantic as well as people just a lot of times feeling lonely. And then certainly the aspect of socially, right? And what's interesting too, and I mean, I think about this a lot, it's just like the anxiety, sometimes the language feels very vivid and precise. We have so many words for anxiety, and sometimes hope gets a little bit more, like, vague and, like, broader in terms of, like, love or faith and so on, whereas we can have a million very specific reasons for anxiety. And it was interesting to see the anxieties really formed a nice timeline of the year of 2018. You know, where we could see, like, you know, say after the Parkland shooting, an uptick of all these responses about gun control. You know, there's a big spike in, you know, Me Too responses during the whole heat of the Kavanaugh moment. You know, and then steady concerns about technology in all of its various forms. You know, some that almost sounded like a koan. Yeah. You know, I'm not quite sure if they canceled that or how that works.
Like, you read it in two different ways, right?
So it can make sense to me in both ways. And then a really steady drumbeat of climate change. As well as, you know, debt and just a whole constellation of these very specific issues, and we're starting to see the scale at which they're operating and then how they're personally expressed. And then my favorite one, you know, Kate, she's afraid of shadows.
But then there's so much more that she can be afraid of, such as distraction. You know, another big theme on the wall was distraction. I feel unsettled, unfocused, busy. You know, here's a shot of someone's mind. I think a lot of us can relate. And this also, you know, goes hand in hand with a lot of the technology going on in our lives. Too many internet tabs opened. Loneliness, alienation was a big theme on the wall. From I'm going to die alone with my stuffed animals. To I'm afraid, I'm 80 and afraid of being alone. And as we were showing also the loop at the beginning, when you were coming in, that loop of all of those responses are also from the wall, kind of edited and curated. And a lot of those also spoke to loneliness. Like, I don't want to be alone, I don't know how to be alone, or I don't feel like I belong. Another big theme on the wall was to, you know, show the hope side. I like to glom onto the anxiety because it's the things that we often don't share with one another, so it's really fascinating to me. But there was a lot of hope as well, and a lot of them were around growth and resilience. You know, remembering that we've gone through really tough times in our lives, and that we can continue to grow if we tend to the things that matter most to us. A lot about inner strength and the support for one another. And then just a lot of hopes that are around gratitude, which are helpful, of the small and big things in our lives, the love and support from the people around us, and making plans. I love that. I'm hopeful because I'm making a plan. And it was interesting to us to see that there are many moments where our hopes and our anxieties intersect. Like maybe all of us can relate of feeling hopeful and anxious sometimes being in New York. The future can either be really exciting or maybe unnerving. And many of us have more choice in our lives than ever, and of what we want to be, of what we want to do. And that can be empowering or it can be overwhelming. And the stories we tell ourselves, the things that we believe can have a big impact on our sense of the world and what's possible. So that's a project in a nutshell. And then we've been working with Tracy on this more, and we'd love to hear you talk more about your experience and beyond.
Great, yeah. I mean, this has been very, I talked to you two a good bit now, which is a pleasure, and I'm just always amazed by the incredible wisdom and open-heartedness you brought and bring to this project. And I think my first experience with the monument was with my family, who's here in the audience actually right now. I warned them that I'll be telling a story about them. And so we're frequent Rubin visitors. And so we walked in one day, and there, and we come in and we see this, and we have no idea what it is. And so rather than try to gather information, we just are drawn to it like a magnet. And we walk right up, and we're reading these incredibly personal, touching. So we saw this sense of the deep sense of privacy that was a part of this wall, and then we saw, as you were talking about, the themes that emerged that were much more public. This moment in time, whether it was guns or climate, or there was. I think when we came first in early 2018, there was a lot of Trump, as there often is. And so we're reading this, and we're trying to figure out what was happening. And my daughter, who was 6 at the time, Nandini, she's often the first to get things in our family, and she said, "Oh, I know." She said, "They want us to make the art." And she had seen the cards, and she figured out, so she got right to writing something. And Nandi, I remember one of the first things you wrote, and you were 6 at the time, and one of the words you knew how to spell was love. And so she went right to the hope card, and "I am hopeful because of love," and put it on the. And then my son Kavi, who was 9 at the time, he started inspecting, and I think he was looking for themes very quickly, and he noticed something that you two just pointed out, that often you would see overlap between hope and anxiety. And Kavi, I don't know if you remember this, but you came to me and you asked, "Well, gosh, Mommy, how can you be hopeful and anxious at the same time?" And now I'm a psychologist, and I'm already very moved by this project, and my mind's whirring. And I said, "Okay, this is my opportunity to have a teaching moment with my son." And so I actually wrote down what I said here. I said, "Oh, well, hope and anxiety are really linked, because anxiety is that feeling that your present is out of sync with your hopeful future." And Kavi just sort of looks at me. And I said, "Okay, let me try again." So the second thing I said was, "Well, anxiety lives off your hope for a better future." And he cocks a brow at me. It's like, because that was pretty opaque, to say the least. And then I just said, "Okay, I have to get to the heart of this and stop trying to impress my son, or whatever I'm doing here." And I said, "You're only anxious when you care. And there's a lot in the world right now to care and be hopeful about." And he said, and he got it. So if you ever, when you ever want to get to the heart of the matter, just talk to a child. But that really, I think, that whole experience with my family, with my children, with my husband, Vivek, who's in the audience now too, it was so moving on a personal level because of, as I said before, the open-heartedness that you two brought to the project, I think was immediately perceived by we the participants and co-creators of this project, because people, the genuineness, the pain, the joy that we saw on that wall from the very moment was really moving. So I was moved on that level. And then because I study anxiety, that's one of the main topics that I study in my lab, I immediately thought, wow, this is what I'm talking about. In a way, here's in my ivory tower, as I'm studying the anxious brain, and I'm trying to understand some of the causes of anxiety and how we can help, especially teenagers with anxiety. I thought there's something here that's getting really to the crux of it. And so there were just, so I just want to highlight a few of the themes that really sprang to mind and have continued to inspire me, and I think have been the basis of some of our conversation. And then I'm going to turn it over to all of you, and I'd love to actually have us all talk together. But one of the big themes I think that I started thinking about was this idea that we have right now that we're living in an age of anxiety. Now, we've talked about that phrase, the age of anxiety, has been, it was sort of a post-World War II, the poem by W.H. Auden, that now the world seems to be falling apart and we're living in this unpredictable, uncertain world of anxiety. And we all talk a lot about that. Anxiety, we've talked about this too. It seems like anxiety is the new stress. About 20 years ago, whatever frisson or negative feeling or uncertainty we might be feeling, we'd say, well, I'm really stressed out. And it would sort of be a placeholder for everything. And I think now we've shifted to where anxiety is the new stress. So anything that's about this uncertainty about something coming, about the future, about discomfort, even if it's pleasant discomfort. I'm anxious about this wedding I'm planning, or this, we use anxiety as this sort of placeholder. But what the monument really illustrates to me is that, well, yes, it's an age of anxiety, but maybe not for the reasons we think. Perhaps it's an age of anxiety because anxiety is so closely tethered to as Candy and James use this phrase that I love to describe the monument, the moment that has yet to arrive. Right? It's tethered to the future. And that's really the power, I think, of why not only are anxiety and hope inextricably intertwined, but it's really the source of their power, because it's that future orientation that sort of energizes us and motivates us, right? That we're thinking about this potential future, and maybe we're feeling the frisson of anxiety and worry, but we care about it, and it's propelling us into trying to bridge that rift between where we are now and where we want to be. And hope works the same way. It's not necessarily this milquetoast feel. We really, as we've been talking about the language around hope, it does feel almost a little less exciting and a little like, oh yeah, dreams and fluffy clouds but it's not, because hope is also that sort of that pinprick that keeps us in it to win it. When you're depressed, you lose hope, and you're no longer in the future. But hope keeps us in that activated state. So that was one thing that I think better than anything I've seen in my life, illustrated what I think is a fundamental point about the nature of anxiety, this future orientation as well as hope.
Yeah, I'm curious. So you've done so much. You've done so many studies around anxiety. You have your whole lab. You've done multiple studies. You're doing studies right now. When you look at anxiety, how do you unpack that? Are there different ways that you start to break that giant word apart?
No, it's a great question. I mean, a lot of what we do as scientists is make very complex things simple. Not necessarily accurately so, but we do our best, right? We have to deconstruct to start to understand. And so, anxiety, which is by definition this sort of this sort of apprehension and about an uncertain future, right? What I do in my research lab is I break it down into I'm very interested in some of the thought traps that keep us anxious. So anxiety is a spectrum, and as you were talking about mental health and this idea that we think about it as pathology is something at the extreme, but mental health is like physical health. It's on a continuum, and we don't think about our physical health in that way. When we say physical health, we don't think, oh, because my body is breaking. We think physical health along that full spectrum. And so when I think of anxiety as an aspect of mental health, I think of it on that spectrum. And anxiety is a very cognitive experience because it's linked up with our future orientation. And so there's ways of thinking like worry that can sort of jumpstart anxiety, right? And there are also thought traps that can start to pull us a little bit further along the debilitating spectrum of anxiety. So one thought trap I'm studying right now in my research lab is the threat bias. And it's this habit that some of us have when we're anxious or stressed, to pay too much attention to negative information in the world. And it's like a filter. And so it's a preferential filter where we're all of a sudden weighing the negative more than the positive. So if I often use this example, if I have a threat bias, if I'm experiencing that right now, I may look out into this audience, I may be feeling a little nervous, and I may see that one person in the back who's falling asleep, and I don't think anyone's falling asleep. No one's falling asleep, but if you were falling asleep in the back, I would see you, and I would ignore all the other smiling faces around me, and all the interest in and so you fixate, and you filter in that negativity, and you filter out the positive possibilities. And sometimes we need to do that because there's survival value to that in the moment. But if we do that habitually and rigidly, it creates this habit that now we're in a world in which we're not seeing the potential around us, and we're skewed towards the negative. And we know that this bias is a sort of cognitive engine in anxiety.
Yeah, totally relate. Like the one negative comment versus like compared to the the hundreds of positive ones, it's like the one negative one that can start to like loom on you.
Exactly, and I like to think about that as a filter because I could filter in a million bits of information right now, and it's what we've learned to attune ourselves to that can shape a lot of our experience in the moment and then enduringly over time.
So, I mean, just when thinking about this relationship between anxiety and hope, and the bias, I was just thinking about like the role of the imagination, because as you were talking about it, for some reason this popped into my head was this line from, I think it was Schopenhauer, who's not exactly the most happy person to quote. Like his whole philosophy was like walking is a prevented falling, But I think he said something, but like from where did Dante take the materials of his hell except from the actual world? That it's so vivid and realized, right? There's evidence around it.
Yeah.
Whereas to imagine hope and stuff, there requires some sort of imagination.
Well, that's so fascinating.
And I guess I was just thinking about that in terms of a question I really wanted to ask you, as far as like, objectively, do you think we are a more anxious age, regardless of what we call it? Is it because we have more evidence coming to us from so many different screens or channels, and then we can make this assessment, and it's not maybe irrational?
Yeah, I think that when we talk about this as an anxious age, yes, in a way, despite it's the story we tell us or it's the word we use, yes, we are, but maybe not for the reasons we think. So I think that, if we start to really dig in on this idea that hope and anxiety are two sides of the same coin, then maybe we are a more anxious age because there's so much potential, so much possibility right now. There's an absolute avalanche of information and possibility and uncertainty that we have to cope with on a daily basis. And if we don't have the rituals and the story, I really loved what you said about rituals, I think about this too. If we don't have the framework, the rituals, the story to engage with that avalanche of possibility, then it becomes anxiety-provoking instead of hope-provoking. So again, I think what you did with this project was you gave people tools to start telling their story of hope and anxiety, to engage with it. And that just briefly as a segue brings me to kind of answer in a second part your question about how I unpack anxiety. The other thing about anxiety is that there's this avoidance paradox. So when we're anxious, we do have a tendency to avoid. We don't want to engage with it. But if there's one thing that you can do, that we can do to increase our anxiety and to make it start to become debilitating, it's to avoid anxiety. It's to escape from it. And because what happens is, as we, it's very reinforcing to escape from anxiety in the moment. So you're a little upset, you're feeling anxious, and let's disappear into our phones for a minute and just forget everything. So that's rewarding because for the moment, just in that moment, you reduce your anxiety and you feel better. And so the next time you feel anxious, you might go to your phone again, or you might eat that bag of chips, or you might do, or whatever you do to dampen and to numb yourself. Of course, we all do that sometimes. It feels better to get rid of the anxiety in the moment. But if we do that over and over again, and it becomes our ritual, it becomes our habit, we don't develop the skills to actually cope with the anxiety. And so anxiety grows, and the next time you feel anxiety, it's going to be bigger, and it's going to be more of that monster in the closet that we don't have the tools to cope with. So this avoidance paradox, and the way that threat bias can play into that is, that's also perhaps a driver of this feeling that we're in an age of anxiety more than ever before, because we don't engage with it. And I think what the monument does is that it's a wonderful tool, a heartwarming tool, one that makes us feel connected to others, that allows us to engage. And these are the tools that are crucial right now, I think, at this moment in time.
Should we hear some responses?
Yeah, I was going to say this is perfect time for response, actually. So I think there are other themes that we can intersperse as people bring up their experiences, but just, did you want to add something to that?
No, maybe throughout later.
So at this moment, we'd love to turn it over to you, the audience, to perhaps share some of your reactions to the themes that we've brought up now, perhaps talk about whether this does it make sense to you, this experience of the inseparability of hope and anxiety, and how might that play out in your lives? And yes, sir. And I think we have a microphone we can pass around to. Oh, sorry. Oh,
Thank
okay.
you.
Yes. Okay.
Okay. Thank you. My question is: Do you think hope and anxiety are the most basic feelings of human being? And is it because of this people respond to it more enthusiastic, because people don't want to feel alone, they just want to feel, I'm not alone. So I feel hope, and so other people also feel hope. I feel anxiety, so other people also feel anxiety. So people respond to this. So because they're so fundamental compared to other feelings.
I would agree they're fundamental. I'm sorry.
The second question is...
Could we start with one at a time? Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I would just say to that, too, they are fundamental, but on another level, as a psychologist, they're not fundamental and basic. I mean, we think of fundamental things like fear, but fear and anxiety are very distinct. Fear is, and we share fear with all animals, and fear is this immediate response to present danger. Anxiety is a little different. It's actually this response to potential or possible danger that has not happened yet. So actually, for that reason, anxiety is this triumph of human evolution. It's extremely sophisticated because it relies upon our very cognitively sophisticated ability to project ourselves into the future. And I think the power of anxiety, we think about it always as this pathology, but actually it's incredible superpower, because it tethers us and allows us to think into this future and to notice that where we are now is not necessarily where we want to be. But I think, I agree 100% that absolutely right, we all share this. What I think of as very sophisticated human accomplishment. And I don't know if you wanted to add to that.
No, I mean, knowing you're not alone, I think that's a big part of what a lot of these projects are about, and I think it could be one of the greatest gifts we can give to other people, that our struggles can be turned into our greatest service to others, that a lot of that stuff usually gets hidden. What a tragedy that many of us feel like we're the only one going through something. And what we've seen from the monument and other projects is, wow, nearly all of us feel like we're barely keeping it together. And in some ways, when you see the hopes, when I've seen the hopes, it reminds me of all the gratitude and other things I need to remember to be thankful for and appreciate. And I've seen a lot of responses on the anxious side where it's like, I'm anxious because I read all these anxieties, on the wall. But I also think, though, the anxiety side, I always got drawn to it because, to me, it is so consoling. Like, for me, these are the things we often don't share, so it's so consoling, and that can be in itself such a value, just to know that you're not the only one going through this, that we're all like, I don't know what I'm doing, I'm trying to figure things out, that there is so much that we often don't share, and it was up there for all of us to see, and to see oftentimes then how other people are dealing with it. And that's what I also hope we can do here in this room, is that with time, that we can share some of the things that we are anxious and hopeful about right now in our lives, and perhaps as a group, we don't have answers, but maybe many of us have different experiences that are similar that we can share, and that in that way we can help each other by sharing our own struggles and how we have, coped and moved and forward and grown.
I think there was maybe a brief second part. Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you. The second part is like, since the anxiety is so sophisticated, like a feeling, do you think there any age-related, like since when we develop anxiety or hope? Like since 1 year old, 2 years old, or how is it developed, the hope and anxiety?
Oh, sort of the developmental, when developmentally do we develop? Anxiety, you can see very early on. So, and we actually, it's developmentally expected that children will have separation anxiety from their caregivers, you know, before or around the year of 1 year. And, you know, and so actually this, and this is such an important point for me as a researcher, because I've spent my life, most of my, my career studying anxiety only as a mental illness. And I've only in the past, you know, relatively recent period realized that that's a limited view of anxiety, because it is a normal human experience. And perhaps the best way to understand it is not to just wait till it's at the extreme and then say we have to treat it and remediate it, but to understand the full spectrum of anxiety, how we can leverage anxiety in powerful ways and positive ways in our life, especially as we observe that early on it's a normal human experience, even from the first months of life. Hope, we're not great in psychology studying the positive sides. And so I actually don't know when hope first comes online developmentally. It's a wonderful question. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm curious though, you know, as, a sweeping statement, I don't know, you might object to this, but as it feels like we have more and more choice in our lives, we get to choose what we want to do, who we're in a relationship, you know, and beyond, what kind of career we have. Do you think that causes a lot of other unintended consequences, including way more anxiety, because you have so much freedom of who you can be and what you can do and who you can be with, and the possibilities are endless, that creates, that then you could say, maybe is there more anxiety today?
Because of that. Yeah. Well, it's a great point, because we, you know, another cognitive linchpin in anxiety is intolerance of uncertainty. So for many of us, that complete array of choices, it's hard for us to live with and to tolerate. And I think part of the reason is because perhaps as human beings, we have to have that balance of the predictable and the unpredictable. And we used to get that through religion, through ritual, through maybe social mores that were too strict, but it was something that you could anchor in. And so maybe we've gone a little too far on the other side. Not that we have to go back to strict social mores or one religion or the other, but rather maybe because, and I have to agree with James's point about the absolute and complete consumerism right now that's driving our lives, maybe we don't have those anchors of something greater than ourselves to believe in, to work towards. And that doesn't have to be God or belief, or it can be a cause, it can be saving the planet. My son said to me the other day after we watched that TV show, what was it, Covey, the Earth one?
It was called
Our Planet. Yeah, he said, wow. Now, my son is 10 years old now in 4th grade, and the point is made that in 20 years, this has to be figured out, or...
Yeah.
And so Covey said, he said, wow, I guess my generation really has a big responsibility. We have to figure this out. But anyway, but that could be that thing that is the great thing to work towards that gives you that North Star. But that's a wonderful question.
Just one thing really briefly. In the first part of your question, you hit on something that really struck me that I'd love to carry with us, which is just this idea of, you're talking about anxiety being carried to somebody else, and they have anxiety, or hope being carried. Just the idea of thinking of these things, I don't know, almost like a contagion in a way of like, you know, with the way that our media works, the way that, you know, by design there's profit in keeping us anxious, but the way that it sort of is transmitted, you know, I think is really interesting.
Yeah, I've had this discussion before. Maybe we can talk about the right metaphor. I'm a little nervous about the contagion metaphor.
Oh, that was pretty full on.
And the whole viral, you know, because I think, because then you have this disease model and there's some sort of contagion that's but it's a very, right, how does that happen? And what is the right metaphor? And if we get that metaphor right, there's power in that metaphor, there's power in that story. Was there another question? Yeah, maybe you can I think this gentleman here had his hand up. Hello.
Thank you so much. This is a subject that is tremendously close to me, so I really appreciate your passion and connection to this. And I'm just recovering from a whole lifetime of intense PTSD, so all of these things are very meaningful to me. I have a million questions, so I will try to just get to a basic point. After 30 years, I'm getting back to the value of early childhood education, because if we start at the beginning And especially research has been shown that things that you know about, the best natural systems thinkers and design thinkers happen to be 4 years old, that are outperforming high school students in creative problem solving. So I have a little video you were talking about after the Board of Ed told me no 3 times, where I have 5-year-old Dominican descent kindergarten kids who in 20 seconds say the basics of life better than any politician. 5-year-old said, my wish for the world would be that everybody should get along together. People should share, everybody should be friends, people should help each other, and that everybody should stop fighting. And then they say the nice little title, which is on YouTube, No Adults Left Behind. But with all of these ideas, and particularly that anxiety, you know who Alice Miller is?
Alice?
Miller,
No.
the president of the International Child Psychiatry Association in the 50s and 60s, and said psychology and psychiatry should be used in order to create a positive education program of what traits and values lead to success in people, not just what damaged you and all of that stuff. So I'm just wondering, when you hear this stuff about early childhood education, and they said, you know, children are our most important thing, education is the most powerful weapon, we're molding and shaping the lives of a future generation, and instead of waiting, nobody knew what a brain was until 15 years ago, so we got this retarded system created by Napoleon to turn kids into soldiers.
Yeah,
So I'm just, when you hear all of this, I'm just curious, especially like your emotions. Alice Miller said emotion attaches meaning to experience. Without an emotion, nothing means anything. And with anxiety, to me, it would be like, you know, I have a problem that needs attention. So it's just guiding my attention that there's something wrong.
It's one of the most important ones.
You know, somebody transplanted my brain and turned me into a Pinocchio puppet. But I'm just curious what your reaction is particularly with the idea of design thinking, which has been turned into every application now as a leading, you know, problem-solving technique in politics groups. Okay, thank you. I talk a lot.
Thank you. Let's start with design thinking. I didn't mean to throw you in.
No, it's a fantastic question. I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to shed too much light on it because I feel like I almost have too much to say about it. Just the nature of the way that we talk about design and approach it, like it's just sort of become, I think it's become very trendy as a term that tends to get bogged down in a lot of jargon. Like right now the big term is like...
Kelly Brothers specifically that empathy is the starting point for all connections and discussion.
Okay, yeah, I think my background in it might be a little from a different vantage point, but there's this idea of like, you know, human-centered design, and you know, and it's like, well, what else would it be? But I think this idea of just basic problem solving, basic empathy, basic compassion, I think has sort of been commoditized and resold and sort of like created into all these separate silos that I think is doing a big disservice to a lot of the students that I'm teaching. So I would rather return back to a basic ethical underpinning and a basic humanism and liberal arts. What?
But anyway, I'm sorry, I get very passionate.
No, likewise. So maybe I'll just end there. But yeah, I do think that design thinking has become a little garbled.
It's interesting with, you know, empathy is a very interesting human experience because I think historically we've gone from completely, especially in the study of human emotion and social emotion, we neglected it for decades. And it took 2 women actually at the NIH who started, particularly Carolyn Zahn-Waxler, who is actually my academic grandmother, I'm happy to say, who was one of the first psychologists to promote the scientific study of empathy in children, its development, how it happens, when it happens. And in the past 30 or 40 years, this area of research in developmental psychology has a very important, it's very central and is very important in education and other areas now. And I think one thing is that empathy, we do think about it as this good thing, which it is. But empathy is a tricky character because as we think about promoting empathy in our children, and isn't that what we want to do? From the cradle to really help our children tune into their human empathy. I mean, children, yes, they're these wonderful beings from the get-go, but I do believe children have to be taught and perhaps civilized a little bit, whatever that civilized means. But one thing that happens with empathy is that when empathy is so deep that in our empathy for someone else, we become overwhelmed with emotion, with their emotion, and maybe that contagion is a good metaphor then, you can't regulate that experience, you actually become less helpful, less pro-social, and less empathic over time. So as we think about promoting empathy in our children, we also have to think about promoting their tools, the tools they have, to regulate that deep human natural experience.
Thinking has systematized it, and it's there.
The regulation of an emotional experience in design thinking? I don't know about this field. No.
Stanford University, Kelly Brothers, look them up.
That's interesting. Yeah, very interesting. Thank you. Maybe another question? There were some other hands up. Oh, yes, please.
Just a few comments and then a question. I think that when you talk about anxiety and you tie it into hope, I think that's really important. I think that if you think about that, hope is really something that can actually have a physical benefit for people. If you talk about people who are terminal and they still have hope about their disease, they tend to do better. And once the doctor says, "I can't do any more for you," you can see them decline very quickly. And I think we see that very quickly in the medical community. Also, just another comment about anxiety. There's a lot of talk about the anxiety of the ancestors being passed on to us. There's a lot being written about that now. So that's a whole other study.
You mean heritability of anxiety?
Inheritability of anxiety, yes, exactly. But the other thing that I was thinking about in today's situation, hope usually implies that there's something that maybe you can do about a situation to make it better, to address your anxiety. Given the situation today, we have a lot of people who are trying to do a lot to alleviate their anxiety, and we've been talking about the political especially, because I know you mentioned Trump. But I think that when you get this feeling of hopelessness because you aren't able to cause something to get better, and you have the experience of through your efforts you don't see something getting better, I think that that impacts your health. And I'm wondering if the mental health community that you're involved in is talking about this actually right now.
I think one way we're talking about that is that we know that there's a very high co-occurrence of anxiety and depression. And we have a lot of theories and a lot of studies for decades and decades that talk about that. But I think what you just described is actually on a conceptual and experiential level at the heart of it, because you can have anxiety. Say, let's take illness anxiety as one in the context of recovery or chronic illness. You will have anxiety. That's natural. And in many ways, that if you engage with that anxiety, it can help motivate you to seek the right treatment to do what you need to do. But the moment that you start to lose hope that there's potential for positive change, or there's, and really hope and anxiety are probably every day people are going through that, experience that almost simultaneously. And the minute that hopelessness starts to outweigh the hope anxiety engine, so to speak, that's when depression and experiences of depression can start to come online. And again, let's not think about depression only as a mental illness, but rather as a state. And when we start to think about anxiety and depression not as traits but as states, we can see how they can co-occur. One can take one can be in the driver's seat one day and the other can in the other day. And we understand too that we can engage with these experiences and they don't have to be debilitating diseases that we have to eradicate at all costs. And by having that framework, that story that we tell about things like anxiety, hope, and depression, we have a chance then to engage and use those experiences instead of being defeated by them. So that's sort of, yeah, right, exactly. Thank you.
I'm curious, if you want to share, what do you do when you feel hopeless? Or if anyone else wants to share, what are the things you do when you feel hopeless? If you want to share or not, and it can be later too.
I think a lot. I try and analyze what it is that's causing that anxiety. I remember doing that since I was a child.
Mm-hmm.
When I was 5, 6, 7 years old. If I didn't feel good, I would make myself try and identify why and try and do something about it. But my point is that today, people are trying to do something about what's causing their anxiety. And they're running up to a lot of resistance. They're not seeing progress. And I think that's extremely frustrating. And I think that, and I have quite a number of friends who are in the mental health community, and what they're saying is in their practice, they are seeing so much more anxiety and depression than they've ever seen in the past, in the past couple of years.
Yeah, I'll just quickly say something because then I'd love to hear from the audience member who has the microphone, but I'll just say I think the data are a little, I think clinicians in this city do talk about that, and I'm not a clinician, I'm a researcher, and the stats, as you look at epidemiological statistics, you do see these rises, but it's a little deceiving because you can also frame the charts in ways that project what you want to project. Teenagers and young adults are experiencing more anxiety. A lot of that actually is due to girls and young women. So as we think about that, and the other thing too is that there are a lot of people seeking treatment for anxiety, but one thing I think that is a systemic problem is that a lot of those solutions are not engaging solutions. They are escapist solutions, in the sense of not in any judgmental way of escapism, but rather avoidance. And I think there's a great place for anti-anxiety medications, but we use them chronically instead of for brief periods to get back on track. And medication is fundamentally avoidant because you're not engaging with that experience and allowing yourself to cope with it. If you're chronically using it, again, I don't think in short term that I'm not judging that at all or saying it's bad. I think it's helpful in combination with therapy especially. But again, yes, we are seeking solutions, but perhaps they're not the engaging solutions that a lot of therapists, and I'm sure with your friends and colleagues, who are using techniques that allow people to engage rather than avoid. So I just wanted to quickly respond in that way. I think someone has the microphone.
Yes. Hi. I have personal examples. First, with anxiety, I have a lot of memory problems. I have PTSD. And then with hope, I get hope from crunch. I work out.
Uh-huh.
That's what I had to share.
No, that's wonderful. A wonderful psychologist who's one of the founders of one of our research associations, the Association for Behavioral and Cognitive Therapies, Al Kasdan. He once said, "Oh, hey, there's something going on." Wait, I thought someone was like Al Kasdan, but it was something else. Sorry. Al's awesome. I'm sure he'd love the shout out. But he said something fascinating at one of our big, research conferences. He said, if we really, and this is the guy who developed some of the best evidence-based cognitive behavioral therapy treatments out there, for kids especially. And he said, if we really wanted to help people, we'd first get them to exercise. And then we'd see what that takes care of. And then we'd create boutique treatments that targeted the things and the experiences that were left over. And that's what we do. And those could be outsourced to it doesn't have to be all of us PhD shrinks but we'd be able to create tools that could target those things. That's what we would do if we really wanted to help people. So I really hear what you're saying about the importance of exercise.
Hi. I have the mic. Is it okay? Over here, back here. Actually, I have a T-shirt of hope on, but I'm going to talk about anxiety. You have mentioned about avoidance with anxiety. And unfortunately, I've dealt with a lot of people, work situations where I've been taken advantage of and avoided dealing with the problem. So I deal with a lot of anxiety because I haven't attacked or dealt with the problem. So I do seek mental help for that. But I've been waking up dealing with anxiety the last 2-3 weeks since this happened, because there's another person that, a doctor that I asked for my notes, my medical records, and he's telling me, why do you want them? And I'm like, because I want them, because they're my records. You won't understand it. It's okay. I don't care. I still want my records. Don't you trust me? I deal with paranoia, so I have trusted you. I want my records. I send it to your other doctor. I said, you do know I have the right to have my medical records, right? Wow. So he got upset, and then he's like, well, I'm gonna charge you, and then, before I've gotten them for free, but it wasn't just easily done. So then those records, they said, well, I'm ready for today. So I said, well, I'll take the other record. It was like 4 pages. So she went back, spoke to the doctor, and he came back and told her to tell me well, if I want like the 4 pages, then I have to get my whole entire records. That's going to cost $45 to $75, opposed to 75 cents a page for 4 pages. So I'm thinking, maybe he doesn't understand what's going on. How is he going to demand me to come out my pocket with $75? I'm only asking for 4 pages. He can't demand. I mean, he's like robbing me without a gun. I said, can you please go tell him he can't demand me to pay for all of this that I do not want. If I sign that sheet and ask for this day, which is 4 days, that's all I want. She came back and said, well, I reiterate, this is what he said. I said, you know what? Because I've had issues with him trying to hide my diagnosis. Unfortunately, I have rheumatoid arthritis. He's taking me off all my medication. I feel like he's trying to support Social Security to not support what I have, but I wake up with pain, inflammation. And so finally we got the blood test, and he's like, well, you have an inflammatory disease. I said, Doc, you know what I have, right? What do I have? You have rheumatoid arthritis. I said, so be honest. Why are you hiding my stuff? So that's one issue. So when I went back to him, so then I said, you know what? I'm going to think of formal complaints. I had the formal complaint with the
Can
hospital.
I ask you a question about
Yes.
this? Do you feel that in this, I'm very sorry for this experience of yours, because the fact that it's a wonderful thing that you're strong enough to advocate for yourself, and not all of us are able to do that, so that's real kudos to you. Do you feel like in this process that your hope and anxiety were sort of working in some way to get, I just see you as a very motivated person, but how did hope and anxiety come into this for you?
Because, I felt hopeful. I said, you know what, I am going to expose him. I'm going to the news. Because maybe other people are dealing with this. Because I feel like there's been so many issues that I've dealt with. I can't even, I could write a book because people won't believe the things that I've dealt with people that you expect to be doing the right thing for you, in high positions that are not, in the medical positions that are not, and it's just unbelievable. And I've been feel like I've been battered because I haven't dealt with it. And you go tell a psychiatrist, but then it's like, it's there, but it's not enough you're dealing with. So I finally did write a 6-page facts about my complaint to him. There's a mental and patient abuse and writing the formal complaint and all of this stuff. So I told my psychiatrist, I started reading a few pages. He said, okay, well, you got it off your mind, but I don't even feel it's good enough because unfortunately I'm in a position where I'm transitioning to wait for this place that I'm getting, which is a whole nother situation going on. So I'm staying with someone. I'm like, the news is coming here. She's like, not here. So I can't really, I want to go to the news and go right in front of his office and explain what happened and see if other people are dealing with this problem. And every day I'm waking up with this anxiety that I feel like I'm not doing enough to expose him. Let me just say that, and making me feel better that it's done. Because I wrote the formal complaint to the health department, that complaint department thing.
Thank you for sharing that. Could I open it up too? Because I have a feeling a lot of people in this audience, as we think about hope and anxiety, it's in the context of illness. We've mentioned this. Can I open it up to others who might have had a similar experience? Thank you again for sharing that, Miss. Was there someone up front? I see a couple in the middle.
Hi.
And in the back. I can't see anything really from here in terms of hands, so
I don't really have anything to share as far as the anxiety, but I did want to say thank you for the monument. I love the fact that you actually call it a monument. I was kind of disappointed when I walked in today and it wasn't there.
It's in their closet.
I'd love to come over, but I have to tell you, the anxiety was palatable when you were on that side. You could actually feel it kind of coming off the wall. And looking at it, it did make me anxious because it reminded me of things that maybe I forgot that I should be anxious about. and I went to the blue side continually, and I tried to force myself to go into the red side until I realized these are all people that are sharing experiences that aren't really unique and different. because we all share it at some point in our lives. I have to believe that, because I have to believe I'm not alone. So thank you so
Thank
much.
you so much for sharing
Very
that.
nice. It's the opposite of social media too, which is so curated, and this is so honest and real, and it's just.
But I had to keep doing. I would look at the anxiety, then I'd have to run over the blue side as a chaser, and come back. And I just want to say briefly to thank you to everybody who shared, and particularly this idea of avoidance. And somebody mentioned something. I think you had mentioned something about action and agency, and it just made me remember something that I think hopefully might be helpful that I had gone through, where, I struggled with anxiety intensely. I mean, I still do, but and I don't know if it's hereditary. My mom had agoraphobia, panic disorder. I've got alcoholism, all these things. And I remember I'm like, I'm going to deal with it, and I went to go see a psychiatrist, and I thought I was going to get, questions about my mom and ink blots and all of that. Within 3 minutes, she wrote me a prescription for Xanax. And for somebody like me, where it said take as needed, that was not good. I didn't know. And thankfully, I dealt with that and got the help that I needed. But this idea of action, I think, is really interesting, where like this idea that hope implies that I can take some sort of action. And the reason I struggled with it so much was because I thought I could take action against anxiety. Like, I'm going to fight this thing. And there was a moment, maybe about 10, 12 years, no, like less than that, 8 years ago, but it doesn't matter, like where my dreams came true. I had written a thing, and somebody asked me to stand on a stage and talk about it to people. And I got to go up and stand on stage, and at that point, I'm a walking panic attack in general in my life, right? And I get up and stand there and I start reading my thing. It's too much panic, and I actually said, I'll be right back, I have to go, to this audience, right? And I left. And people are very forgiving. I came back 10 minutes later and stumbled through the thing. But my panic was so bad, and it just skyrocketed after that. So when you're talking about avoidance, it got so bad. Coming up here today, in my head, thanks to something that Tracy had mentioned, my mantra was, I'm anxious because I care, I'm anxious because I care. And just to accept it, that's going to be there. It's always going to be there, I guess, but I can learn to relate to maybe a little bit more skillfully or something. But as I was listening to people, it just reminded me of what happened when I tried to say, I'm going to fight this thing. Mm-hmm. And somebody very smart in my life told me, put down your guns, the war is over, just accept that it's going to be there. Yeah. And it helped me a lot even today just to say, okay, this is just proof that I care about this, and I'm going to sit here and be a little fidgety, and it's fine, So anyway, the avoidance and action thing I think is interesting, of where do you choose to take the action and point it, because sometimes it can not work out so well.
So I have a question here in the back. I'm very curious to understand if there's anything that emerged either on the scientific side or in the art project about the role of the present in providing maybe a counterpoint, because both anxiety and hope are in the future, right? And I happen to practice a lot of yoga. It helps me in staying grounded, And to me, the first reaction in looking at the wall, unfortunately, I couldn't see it in person, but just listening while you talk about it today made me feel very emotional. And I feel like maybe it's because it brings the present to the present, the sense that there are a lot of people sharing similar things, right? So that's what I got out of it, is the sense of connecting with the present. But I'm very curious to hear if there's anything like that emerged for you all.
I love the notion of time in all of this, because I think it's central. Thank you for that beautiful question. And I've thought a lot about this because I'm so interested in this future orientation that anxiety and hope are sort of hitched to. And I think about it this way. When you're anxious and hopeful, you are moving into the future, right? And when you're sort of ruminating and maybe a little blue or a little, and in an extreme form, depression, you're a little more stuck in the past, right? So and both of those experiences take us out of the moment. But what I believe about that is that the solution, therefore, is not don't be hopeful or anxious, never be blue, but it's to engage with those experiences so that they're still flexible. Because when we avoid and think about anxiety as debilitating, depression is always a disease that's debilitating. And of course, depression is a clinical diagnosis, it is, but when we instead say, wait a second, these are human experiences that I can, I think it was beautiful what you said, James, about just to be with that notion of it's I care, or all of a sudden you have that flexibility and you can move along the whole timeline. You can be in past, present, and future. and have that skill set and that flexibility to be in the present really as much as possible, probably, and to be in that flow, but to also be able to move into the future when you need to and otherwise. But that's how I think of it when you said that. Those were sort of the thoughts that came to my mind.
I like that. It felt kind of cosmic. You can be in the past, in the present, and the future, dude. There was a lot on the monument about being in the present moment, certainly on the hope side. And it's interesting because I think that I certainly have a lot of anxieties where reminding myself to breathe, right, that helps a lot, and to just be in the moment. Here we are on stage together. There are other anxieties where like just being in the moment is not going to make them go away, right? It's kind of avoiding them, and they're going to come later. So I think it depends on the kind of what the root cause of those sort of feelings are. But it is interesting, I think, as we're thinking about even, they say, the Rubin Museum, as many of us are looking for alternatives and different ways for us to take care of our emotional health. Many of those tools are here in this museum too. This is one of the most contemplative museums that I've ever been to. They have such good mood lighting. The exhibits are really beautiful and well designed. And thinking about these kinds of spaces in our lives where we can be more aware of giving ourselves the kind of framework and the space and the rituals, right? To tend to these things that I think depends on our personality. For me, like, I'm a avoider of many issues, and so for me it's really important to create these rituals, create these spaces in my life to remind myself of the things that are most meaningful to me, because it's so easy for me to get distracted by the day-to-day stuff.
Hi.
So I have a question for James and Candy about your practice. So you're making a lot of this beautiful life-affirming work, but there's also the weight of holding space and memory for other people's fears and anxieties. So I love the story how you have all 53,000 of these in your closet, right? It's taking up physical space, right? But it's probably also taking up emotional space for you too, right? So yeah, what if you'd be willing to tell us about the rituals you have for yourself, maybe just managing yourself as both an individual but also as an artist, and how those relate? Is there a cost you're willing to talk about, or what does it mean to everybody is giving you a lot of these things. How do you handle it?
Wow, I never thought about that closet as such a metaphor.
Yeah. There are certain times where it's wow, look at all this. Look at the gamut of humanity here, right? The weight of us, and the joy, the pain, the struggles, the fear, the brooding, the everything, all at once. This is the full gamut of humanity, and a lot of times we don't get to see this. So for me, it's most of all, simply consoling, not overwhelming, but really consoling to me, just how much we are trying to make sense of our lives, how much we are also willing to share it with others. And I think having these responses, and James and I have been experimenting more with taking these responses and creating these video loops, like the one that was playing at the beginning. I feel hypnotized. We were talking about I feel like I could watch this for hours, be in a room with this loop of all of these really deeply heartfelt responses from people about the things that matter most to us across the board. But I think it also speaks to our need for more spaces to discuss this, right? To destigmatize discussion of emotional health in public with others. As far as rituals and other things, I definitely have had moments of hopelessness in my life, moments, periods, weeks, and beyond. And I think what's helped me is, I think over time I've realized what's helped me is that to sort of accept it a little bit first, that I know this is happening, but then also to allow it to be a time to let me make this a time to absorb. This is when I gather all the books, I read a lot, I watch lots of movies that are inspiring to me, I go to a lot of art exhibits. I do this all the time, but especially when I'm depressed. It reminds me of all the things that make me want to come alive. And that's the thing that when I'm hopeless, that's what I do. I go to all of the books, writing, music, films, these creative forces that really inspire me and sort of light that fire again. And then I have a lot of emotional health rituals. I keep a journal, daily journal, dream journal, and I use the I Ching, which is the inspiration for the big Atlas of Tomorrow mural, which for me is this secular tool, this sort of framework to begin to make sense of my abstract inner life. You know, it helps me look at things with a new perspective. You know, it covers all parts of the psyche, from like courage, anxiety, brooding, and beyond. And actually, James and I are turning this into a book that'll come out in the future called The Atlas of Tomorrow. But there are all sorts of, different rituals. James and I lift weights. Yes, so talking about physical fitness and that connection.
I don't feel any sort of a cost to having. That's a really interesting thing, because I realize I feel very lucky to be able to see all these responses from people, and almost kind of grateful or honored just to be able to bear witness to all these things that people are sharing. And frankly, I need that, because when I wake up, my lizard brain is in full swing. You know, I'm just like, I want money and coffee and a pat on the head and whatever. And so, as far as concrete rituals go, very quickly, it's, I do meditate. That's boring. Who wants to hear about that? But I have to sit down and just learn to be a person, right? And I try my best to do that before picking up the phone and letting the world into my head. I call certain people like every single day. And the thing with those rituals, I guess all I would add is, I don't like meditating. I don't like calling some of these people or these things I have to do. But they're these physical actions, and that's the important thing for me, because I feel like then they become a gesture of, I'm learning that they're a gesture of humility. Because I know if I wake up in the morning, I'm like, I'm fine, I don't need to do that, then it's off to that lizard brain thing, So it's these little concrete habits that I have to have for myself.
See, I don't see who has the microphone. Okay, great.
Hi there.
Hi.
Thank you so much for wonderful, interesting, different perspectives on this subject. My thought is, I have a dear friend from childhood who was raised in a family. The parents were older and subject to a lot of difficulty in World War II. So anyway, she grew up in a family of great anxiety. And I just grew up in an average, dysfunctional, lots of problems, but I'm a relatively hopeful person. So we've had so many interesting discussions about our outlook and how we perceive things. And I was wondering, are there any studies about common paradigms of the way people look at the world? Because I really, in my own experience, think that it really determines the kind of anxiety level that you can have just because of the way you look at the world or experience it.
Yeah, psychologists love those kinds of theories. So there are a good bit of them out there. One that leapt to mind as you were talking, because you're sort of talking about outlook, and it's what we attribute our successes and failures to in life. And when you tend to, and this is more in the depression literature, but when you tend to attribute successes, so you can make attributions, let me start by saying this, that are internal or external. So it's because of you or the world. They can be stable or global, right? That it's just the situation or all the time. So imagine if every time you have a failure, you make an attribution that's internal and stable. And stable, it's all the time, and it's global. It's every situation. So if that's your style, it's always your fault. And especially if you have a perfectionistic overlay over that, when you don't meet those standards of perfection, it's going to really hit you hard. The other sort of, the flip side of that is that, well, when I have a failure, it's, maybe it's internal, I can take responsibility, but there's also forces around me that I can see. That's internal, external kind of flexibility. Instead of being stable, you can be unstable, right? You can say, well, sometimes it's this way and sometimes it's not. So it's not always me or it's not always the world. I can judge, so it gives you, again, that flexibility is infused in. And then rather than being global, being more specific helps, because you take each thing as it comes instead of saying, well, I didn't get that job because I'm just not smart enough and I interview horribly. And it's always that way, and it's in every situation. Instead, you can say, well, this time I didn't do so great, but that interviewer is also a bit of a jerk. And this happened this time, but I'm going to really try to do better next time, and I know it can change. So you can see how just that simple framework of thinking about attributions Okay, so that's just, that's one way that psychology tends to look at it.
Well,
That's so
one other
interesting.
item, I'm sorry, is endorphins from exercise.
Yeah.
I think the more they study the brain, the more they're realizing how endorphins are really connected with your sense of hope. You feel a lot better about the world once
Yeah.
you've had a good workout.
100%, yeah.
Anyway.
And I think we just have a few minutes coming up on the end. Should we
I
have
think
one
we
more question, or do you
have-
want to make a comment?
I
Or
want to ask you more. I feel like that stuff is so interesting to me. So like now that we've written our anxieties and hopes, like
Yeah,
to me,
yeah.
like the things that you just shared are really interesting about how we can look at that then. Where does that come from? What are the stories we tell ourselves? Are there other thoughts, insights from your experiences, studies and stuff?
Yeah,
that
how do we
might
make sense of that?
Right,
Yeah.
might be helpful as now that we've written them down and like at least, took that first step, like how can we look at this?
Well, that's interesting. I mean, we could sort of, I never thought about that. One way is to think about, we can't infer necessarily attributions from some of this, but we can imagine what if their attribution for this anxiety that I'm stuck on this one path. What if that attribution is internal and stable and global versus some other attribution, and you can start to see how that same card can mean something very different to a person depending on the meaning they could assign it. But